Coming into this season, Bruce Pearl was 1-11 in games played at Rupp Arena. So after registering his second win and Auburn's first since the Reagan administration in Rupp Arena, the Auburn coach had this to say.
I was prepared to win, but I was also prepared to lose, which I've done a lot in this building.
It's not just Bruce Pearl and Auburn. At first, I assumed the reasons for this were complex, layered with a multitude of factors. But as I dug deeper, I found that it might actually be quite simple. Looking into all of the reasons home court advantage existed, I landed on 3 main categories, which we'll break down and try to debunk in just a minute. Before that, I needed to make sure that the phenomenon of home court advantage was real. So how would I go about proving home court advantage existed? Well, first of all, I found studies from professional researchers that proved that it existed. That helped. But I wanted to see for myself, was it observable in my favorite team, the Kentucky Wildcats? Looking through Kentucky's history, it was undeniable. They perform worse on the road, just as the mountains of already researched and proven data said they would. In their entire history, Kentucky has lost 768 games. Only 190 of them have been at home. In fact, they have had 33 seasons where they have not lost a single home game. But of course, it's not just Rupp Arena. Winning on the road, even for the winningest program in all of college basketball history, is tough to do. 391 of Kentucky's losses have been true road games. That's more than double the home losses, despite playing way more games at home. Even when adjusting for the easier schedule Kentucky plays in November and December, the trend holds true. Kentucky is much better at home. And then there was one season that stood out in particular, 2011. That year, Kentucky basketball lost nearly every single SEC road game except for South Carolina and, of course, Tennessee. But at home, they didn't lose a single game. To assume home court advantage didn't exist would be to believe in the infinitesimal odds that Kentucky and really every other team in college basketball just so happens to play their worst games on the road. So while my research wasn't as scientific, I think my Googling coupled with their actual research should prove to you home court advantage is a real thing. But why? So let's start with the first category. One of the first explanations usually brought up is fatigue from traveling. Traveling is exhausting, whether it's a bus ride or a flight. It's not just about getting from point A to point B, and if you're Tennessee, back to point A before the Final Four. Traveling wears you down physically and mentally. And then there's the hotel. No matter how nice it is, studies show you'll sleep worse in an unfamiliar setting.
A Brown University study found our brains are responsible for this so-called first night effect.
So now you're running on bad sleep, away from your support system, and already worn down from travel. Sounds like the perfect setup for an upset. But is it really the reason teams struggle on the road? To control for this, let's look at a college basketball rivalry where travel really isn't much of a factor. Kentucky and Louisville are just 70 miles apart, an easy day trip. Yet in the last 16 years, Kentucky has only lost to Louisville when the game was in Louisville. Duke and North Carolina, only 9.8 miles apart. And yet the home team still very much has the edge. So maybe the rigors of travel isn't the main culprit. So let's remove that one. That brings us to our second explanation, familiarity. The home team, they know the sight lines, the bounces of the rim, the dead spots on the floor. But beyond that, there's a psychological edge to playing in a familiar setting. To control for this, researchers looked at the NBA, specifically 2 teams that share the exact same building, the Lakers and Clippers. Despite playing in the same arena, the home team still had an advantage. But in college basketball, there's an extra layer of familiarity that the NBA doesn't have. I don't even want to go into this more than what is necessary, so let me just... Instead, there is a different ball used depending on where you play. In 2019, ESPN's Myron Metcalf wrote this article about the effect of using different balls. He noted that Rodney Paul, a sports economist and sports management professor at Syracuse University, conducted a study that showed where teams using a different ball on the road could experience more than a 1-point differential from their expected scoring. And former players have spoke out recently about the advantage. The home team picks the ball. For instance, Auburn uses a Wilson Evo Next, Kentucky a Nike Elite Championship. It's not that I hate the Wilson Evo Next, I hate that there's no uniformity. And then there are the rare environmental factors like altitude, which is why the Denver Nuggets consistently have the NBA's best home court advantage. But if we strip those 2 away, no difference in altitude and the same basketball. Why does home court advantage still exist? And I know what you've been screaming this whole time. The fans, the atmosphere, right? Are visiting teams rattled by the home crowd? Research suggests that while shooting percentages dip on the road, it's not because of the crowd. Free throw shooting, for example, barely changes. So if it's not that, what do fans influence? Let's look at a stat that you would think shouldn't be affected by where you play. Rebounding. How does playing in a different building affect how many boards you get? David Yee, the associate professor of economics at Xavier University, wrote a study about home court advantage that a cheering crowd can serve as a powerful form of intrinsic recognition for athletes. I keep saying intrinsic, it's intrinsic recognition. When a stadium erupts after a big play, it's a form of validation that fuels confidence and motivation. But here's the thing, that same intrinsic recognition is affecting someone else on the court. And here is where the real impact happens. Because in basketball, spectators are not just on top of the players, they're also on top of the referees. When a referee makes a call in favor of the home team and the crowd erupts and cheers, it can act as intrinsic recognition that becomes the form of positive reinforcement that subtly affirms their decision, whether it was the right call or not. Even though referees aim to be impartial, the human brain is wired to seek validation, and thousands of people essentially agreeing with their call can have a reinforcing effect. Over time, this kind of crowd feedback might subconsciously influence referees to lean toward making calls that avoid backlash. It's not about deliberate bias, but rather the psychological pull of affirmation. Studies show that certain key decisions do favor the home team. Not on obvious calls like shot clock violations, but on subjective ones. A block or a charge, a no call versus a whistle, a 50-50 out of bounds play. In fact, road teams have more than 1.5 more subjective calls go against them per game. Road players are 15% more likely to be whistled for traveling. According to the book Scorecasting, a huge chunk of home court advantage can be explained by this very thing. So the authors concluded in their book, long story short, referee bias could well be the main reason for home court advantage in basketball. Everything that creates a home court or home field advantage is simply the referees trying to not upset the home crowd. And a study from Samford University's Center for Sports Analytics analyzed nearly 20,000 Division I games over 4 seasons, including the fan-limited 2020-21 season, and the results were striking. In the COVID years, home teams won less often, visiting teams were called for fewer fouls. Home teams earned fewer free throws and played weaker defense without full crowds. Now, the researchers from this book were looking at the NBA, where officials are year-round, full-time, and are given a very public review. To think that it doesn't exist in college would be crazy. It's likely even more profound. In college, officials aren't full-time. They don't have year-round training, and some of them own their own side businesses. If there's one sport where referees can have the biggest impact on home court advantage, it's basketball. That is because of the one thing the authors of Scorecasting really didn't address when applying the 1 to 3 point difference from the free throw line. By calling more fouls on the visiting team, they're putting more of their players in foul trouble. Even if they do not foul out, wouldn't they naturally start to play less aggressive? That is why I believe it's almost impossible to quantify or to put a number on home court advantage. But you should just know, going on the road means things are not going to go your way. You will get bad calls. It's science. So if you still don't understand it, then you probably have Rocky Top as your ringtone. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe and go Cats.